It's late September in Tuscany, and I have now somehow acquired 2 Italian grandmothers. The first was Nonna Piera. She met me as the very frightened young boy nervously standing in the hallway on his first day in Italy. Now I say boy because if you want to rediscover the true joy and terror of youth, arrive at dusk in a country where you don't speak the local language, and arrange to live with somebody who doesn't speak a word of yours. No matter how old you are, you will instantly be transported back in time to that first terrifying day of school, where everything was just a little too crisp, a little too new and shiny, and you didn't know what to do, whom to talk to, or where to stand. After a wonderful week in the French Pyrenees with my parents, who I'd not seen for years, I found myself safely arrived in Italy, met at the airport by the charming and well-dressed driver engaged by the language school. Now, as he bustles off, smiling at the tip I rather awkwardly thrust into his hand, I'm standing in Nonna Piera's dark apartment in Florence, with all my worldly possessions packed into the 3 small bags arranged at my feet. Somewhat encouraged by actually having found the place, I introduce myself and nervously squeak out the few phrases of basic Italian I know. Piera smiles and lets forth a volley of wondrously rhythmic but completely unintelligible phrases at full local speed. Somewhere in there, though, I hear welcome, and so I smile and we go through the dance of showing the way to the bathroom, how to turn on the bedside lamp, where to put the suitcases, and crucially, of course, how to connect to the Wi-Fi. I disappear for an hour to unpack, and then it's time for dinner. Nonna Piera refuses to believe that I don't actually speak Italian, and thinks that the best way to deal with my complete non-comprehension of the last sentence is to explain with 5 more, delivered slightly faster. Now I learned the hard way in Central America to not just nod and say si, si to everything people say. It seems like a good idea to start with, but sooner or later you find out that you've agreed to buy a car, marry somebody, or act as a drug mule, and so these days I find that silence and a vague, amiable look of interest best suited to these occasions. You can raise an eyebrow to signify that maybe you haven't completely understood, but be sparing. Conversations can go on for a while, and eyebrows can only be raised so far. Strangely, Nonna Piera's approach somehow works. Spanish and Italian are close enough that a few concepts leak through, and I'm pretty sure she's now explaining how to catch the bus tomorrow morning. Florence was laid out in the normal European way of joining up all the places where people already lived with whichever road seemed like a good idea at the time. This was, of course, before international travel, when the traffic was made up exclusively of people who had lived there their whole lives. It's true the occasional invading army would get lost from time to time, but who cares about making things easier for them? Urban planners of Florence had yet to foresee the tens of millions of tourists that would one day descend upon their city. An invading army of its own sort, but happily one that could be persuaded to buy a gelato and a small statue of David as they explored the confusing streets radiating in all directions. Piera's cooking is legendary. The language school has been working with her for 12 years, and the reviews coming back from students across the globe are overwhelmingly positive. I'm about to find out why. Dinner, it turns out, is always a 3 or 4 course meal. Sometimes a small appetizer, always pasta, which unlike elsewhere in the world is not the main dish, but here a sort of second appetizer. Pasta pomodoro, tortellini, spaghetti with pesto and oil, then some sort of meat dish and salad, followed by gelato, fruit, and occasionally tiramisu. On special occasions, or just because we'd had a hard day, the sacred limoncello would be brought out. Handmade from lemon rind and pure alcohol, it was sweet, unforgiving, and strong. After that would of course be the offer of coffee. Never cappuccino, though, which Nonna Piera once treated me to a full 20-minute tirade against. Coffee after dinner, yes, but never cappuccino. Some British swine had dared ask her for this some years back, and she's never forgotten. Or forgiven. I never quite got to the bottom of why this was considered the equivalent of putting your muddy boots on the table, but Nonna Piera's opinions were never mild. I'm finally beginning to understand why my Italian friends growing up held their nonna in such terrified awe. In an Italian household, the grandmother is king, and Nonna Piera is no exception. A force of nature she is, but so too gentle, welcoming, and caring. Ever talking, ever in motion, ever cooking. Nonna Piera was the best possible welcome to Italy I could ever have asked for. My second Italian grandmother is Maria. This time I'm in the countryside, in a lovely hilltop town called Montepulciano. I'm staying with Alessandro and Laura, a hard-working couple on the brink of retirement. They feed and house the Italian students making the daily climb up the hill to the 15th century streets where the language school is situated. Now Maria is Laura's mother and doesn't understand a word I say. But I'm not sure this has to do with the language barrier. She bellows, "Cosa?" at everything I say, even if it's buongiorno, which I'm pretty sure I have down by now. Maria's every gesture speaks of the strength and bitterness of a tough woman who has lived a difficult life. She stomps around the house, yelling at furniture, televisions, dogs, and the miscellaneous students that have all displeased her. It's clearly a complete mystery to her as to why there are foreigners in her house who can't speak Italian, and I suspect that quite a bit of the yelling between her daughter and her is about us. Finding somewhere to stand is becoming a problem. It doesn't matter where I situate myself, she always needs to clean something in the immediate vicinity, and so I frequently have to move while she beats something with a cloth and curses under her breath. This notwithstanding, I eventually make some headway at the table. Sadly, cuisine standards have plummeted since Florence. I'm still grateful to be fed, and most days the food is at least edible, but I pine for the early days. There was that particularly dark evening when Laura went out, and we were left stranded with the combined creations of Alessandro's "cooking's not really my area" and Maria's triumphantly vindictive treatment of beans and sausage. But let us not talk of those times. The wine is always abundant and drinkable, and I never leave with an empty stomach. Dinner is an informal affair, and we keep half an eye on the television, which as far as I can tell seems to be game shows, mafia busts, and the near-daily arrests of politicians indicted for corruption. Laura usually invites us to serve ourselves, but I make a point of helping Nonna Maria first, and she occasionally graces me with a grazie. There is a temporary thawing of tension, and I congratulate myself on acting the good guest. But sadly, after dinner, the one-sided hostilities resume. Mostly, I feel sorry for Klaus, the polite and soft-spoken German who speaks 6 languages and is sitting directly between the television and Nonna Maria. She spends most of the dinner craning her neck to look past him, so poor Klaus is left squirming in his seat, trying to make himself small and invisible, and failing to do either. Klaus drinks a lot of wine and wonders what he's doing here, away from his family in Germany. In the afternoons, I take my charcoal and paper to various locations around Montepulciano and make a brave attempt at pretending to be an artist. The iconic cypress trees and the soft rolling hills are everything you've seen in the movies and more. Generations of artists have drawn and painted this land, and though the scenery is not the most technically challenging, the sheer weight of art history in Tuscany is intimidating. For decades, serious artists have arrived from all over the world on a lifetime pilgrimage to paint these exact hills. As in Florence, my own meagre scratchings seem highly impertinent, and it is some days before I muster the courage to put charcoal to paper. Eventually, I find an out-of-the-way spot so as not to be laughed at, and spend a happy if somewhat frustrating hour trying to capture the fading light on a distant farmhouse. I'm working with brown paper and both black and white charcoal. The white is an unfamiliar and difficult beast, and doesn't blend and smudge the way I expect it to, so the drawing flounders. 3/4 of the way through, I consider abandoning the piece and simply burying it right here. Nobody would ever know, and I can go safely back to drawing less iconic scenes. Maybe abstract art will be my calling. Forever the safe harbour, always welcoming with those soft, forgiving arms the sad and defeated legions of those who can't actually draw. As I ponder the bleak prospect of a future involving the Tate Modern, some faint pulse of determination catches in me, and I resolve to keep going just a little bit longer. I can always bury it later. I get more violent with my strokes and smudging, less attached to creating good art. The white is erased and bolder forms emerge. Then at last, through some judicious omissions and carefully chosen highlights, I finally capture some semblance of the rhythm of the hills and the distant farmhouse, even now changing form in the late afternoon light. I rework a last few details and throw the folio to the ground. It's finished. Or more correctly, abandoned. Someone famous once observed that you never really finish art, you just abandon it in various states of peak. What follows is the most marvellous sense of contentment. I walk around for a while, and then return to the folio lying in the pampas. Drawing back the cover, I dare to look at the result. And much to my delight, the strange magic trick of drawing has once again worked. The lines and forms you've carefully deconstructed, turned inside out, taken from whole to part, stated, wrestled with, erased and redrawn, have now, with the passing of time, somehow mystically refashioned themselves into the whole picture. A wave of emotion surges through me, and I'm awash with the sense of something long sought finally achieved. Some new level reached. This strange and only partly volitional journey to study art in Italy has just taken a huge leap forward. Without expectation and without direction, I find myself unexpectedly on the other side of some crucial barrier, some self-imposed and arbitrary restriction, some sense of perfection that has dogged me and held me back for years. There is nothing perfect here. Not my situation, not the scene, not the drawing materials, not the light, and certainly not my limited technique and talent. It's all imperfect, and so must be put down as such on the page. A mixture of everything, artist and scene, thrown up, cast down in all its beauty and terror, gauche and graceful alike. Walking home, a sense of peace descends, and I take my time, floating slowly through the winding roads. Detached from form and function, process and result. I'm not due anywhere now. I have no specific place to be, and the day's work is done. I turn into our street, and then, walking through the front door, I see Nonna Maria scowling at me from her usual place on the couch. I walk over to her, stand by the side of this bitter and angry woman who will never understand me, and wordlessly show her my drawing. She looks at it for a long time, stares at me hard, and then, just for a moment, smiles.